Hello, welcome to the Center for Scholars and Storytellers' 4th live stream. I can't believe we've done this 4 times. And thank you for tuning in on Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day. Very apropos this topic, our boys tip sheet that is free for download on our website. I feel like a salesperson. But one of our tips number 6 says, show boys talking about love, girls making the first move romantically and sexually, and girls buying flowers for boys. So after you leave here, all of you women who are going out with a guy, please go and buy some flowers for your romantic partner. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our 2 amazing speakers. Sascha Paladino, who is a very successful kids TV writer and also a huge advocate for diversity, inclusion, gender equality. He worked with us on this tip sheet and has been working with us for a very long time. We're very lucky to have him, and I'll let him get into his work he does more. And Caroline Heldman, who has so many titles. I will let her get into it too, but she's basically an expert on gender and politics and works with 2 amazing organizations, the Misrepresentation Project and Gina Davis, and they're both supporters of this boys tip sheet as well. So I'm gonna let them introduce themselves just like we always do and let them start the conversation and talk about this is the scholar, this is the storyteller. Take it away.
Thank you, Yalda.
Great, thanks, Yalda. Do you want to start? Talk about what you do?
Oh, thanks, Sasha.
I just figured I'd throw it to you.
That was quick. I tried to be quicker, but it didn't happen.
Sorry.
So I am the executive director of the Representation Project, and it was an organization started by Jennifer Siebel Newsom, who is now the first partner of California. And back in 2008, she sat down and was looking at media and said, wait a minute, these stereotypes are really damaging for girls. And she produced the film Misrepresentation in 2011. I was a thought partner with her on that because it touched upon a lot of my research. And then as she was traveling around with Misrepresentation, folks were saying, hey, what about boys? Media representations are really damaging for boys and men as well. And so she produced and directed the film The Mask You Live in 2015 that launched this national conversation about masculinity and toxic masculinity, and now has a 3rd film out. So that's one of the hats I wear, and we're really pushing using media in order to push against damaging gender norms and stereotypes. I also work for the Gina Davis Institute. I run the research there, and Gina Davis, as you know, is an Academy Award-winning actor who has started her institute in 2004 when no one was talking about this topic, right? Nobody was really talking. We were talking about it in academia, but nobody was doing advocacy around this work. And so Gina came in and decided that she was going to do research-driven advocacy and also go into the studios, go and speak with the content creators with the idea that, these are not bad people. They just think their content is better or more inclusive than it is. So let's provide the research and then everything will shift. And she was right. If you look at it, we have now achieved gender parity in 2011, gender parity in kids television when it comes to female protagonists and screen time and speaking time. And I will preempt a little bit of data from 2019 that Gina has actually effectively shifted kids in family films as well.
Wow.
So it happened in kids television in 2011 and in 2019 parody in terms of kids films.
Well,
so,
and I can speak to, sorry to interrupt, but I can
Yeah.
speak to the kids TV part. Her research, and I'm sure some of the stuff you've been a part of has really impacted the work we do. As someone who makes kids TV, we're always eager to see the latest information, the latest report. What are they doing? And it's become such a go-to resource for us, the people who make TV, kids TV. So thanks for doing it.
Wonderful to hear, right there. That's why we do the work.
Yeah.
So that's what I do. What do you do, Sascha? How did you get here? What have you worked on?
So I'm a writer and showrunner for kids TV. I started as a writer. I've always been interested in where the arts meet kids. I went to a performing arts high school in New York City, the FAME School.
Oh, I was going to say,
it was the FAME school.
And what were your
I was
arts?
a drama major. We did not dance on the tables, but we did actually have to take gym for all 4 years instead of dance, which I think, I mean, sorry, other way around. We never took gym. We were able to take dance instead, which from what I've heard about regular high schools, having kids taking gym, we were pretty lucky. And that probably affected some of my views as well. But in general, just as I got older, I realized that the arts were more interesting to me when kids were involved. So I was doing theater. I ended up doing some kids theater. I was doing my own writing. I was working as a teaching artist in New York City, going into schools and doing like workshops to get kids ready to see Broadway shows, kids who'd never been to the theater before. I did a workshop on Shakespeare with a bunch of kids in the South Bronx, like things where we were using the arts to communicate with kids, and just saw how meaningful that was. And then a job came up at Nickelodeon at the show Blue's Clues, and that was my first job in TV, and that sort of set the path. It just was this merging of working with kids, writing, creating, and so after working there with the writers, I became a writer on that show, and then went on to write on other shows, become a producer, and then created my own show, which was called Miles from Tomorrowland, on Disney Junior, about a family in outer space, and now
family in outer
family in outer space. But it was great because it gave me a chance to sort of work out what I thought the ideal roles within a family should be, based on kind of my personal experience, but also just what I saw in the media and what I'd seen on kids TV before. So that was really amazing, unique opportunity, and also to think about the future. The show takes place in the future, so it was like, what do I hope the family of the future will look like, and those interactions, figuring those out. And now I'm executive producing, showrunning a new show called Mira Royal Detective, also on Disney Junior, and it's set in an India-inspired land, and that premieres next month in March.
Well, tell us about that, the process of creating an animated show. So you have this new show. You said it's India-inspired. So there've got to be, as you're going in and taking or basing something on another culture, what are some of the challenges there, and how does that process work?
That's a great question. So this show isn't one that I specifically created. It had been worked on by a great writer named Becca Topol, and she had been working on it with Disney. And what when I came aboard, we were trying to sort of structure it into a TV show that would last over however many seasons. And one of our goals was to really find a way to portray this culture, South Asian culture, in a way that was thoughtful, sensitive, both would be recognizable to people of that culture, but also create an accessible entry point to people who are not from that culture. Because as we know, media is such a powerful tool to introduce people to new things, new cultures. And for a show on Disney, we know that these shows reach such a wide audience. I think this show, and like Miles from Tomorrowland, is going to be on in something like 150 countries. So it's a big responsibility to think about what these images that we're putting into these shows are, and but it's also a privilege. It's a great thing. I feel so lucky that I get to do that, and it's why we spend so much time on the details, like every interaction between two members of a family, between a husband and a wife, between a mother and a son, between a father and a daughter. Like, what is in that, and what can we do to make it both realistic, but also hopefully idealistic in a little bit of a way? What do we want to see from those relationships?
Well, let's talk about idealism for a moment.
Yeah.
So you actually did create Miles from Tomorrowland, and you talked a bit about this is the family you would want to see in the future. Can you talk about the creation of that idea, and also how the importance of having kind of utopian ideas so that we can see other ways of living?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, that's what I love about science fiction, because we can make what we want to see come true. And that's one great thing about animation, too. We can create these worlds, and we literally did in that case. But it was kind of a mix of trying to find a relatable family situation that kids at home would recognize, and also a sort of ideal. So in that case, what I really wanted, it was really important from the beginning for me to have the mom. So there's a mom, a dad, and a daughter and a son. And I wanted it to be a situation where the mom was the captain of the ship. It just felt like something I hadn't seen before in science fiction. It was our spin on Lost in Space, Star Trek, those kinds of things. And Star Trek is a great example of kind of idealism in action, and creating an incredibly diverse situation, and they did break a lot of ground. But I thought this was just something I hadn't seen, the idea of a family who's working together in space, and the mom is really driving things. So the mom is the captain of the ship. Everyone knows that. Everyone recognizes that. But it was also really important that the dad did not kind of fall by the wayside as a result. There's sort of these tropes, and I think we'll probably get into this a little more later, of the male being sort of like the comic relief, or the husband is kind of a doofus.
Bumbling.
Exactly. Yeah. And I had from the beginning wanted the dad to be an inventor. It just fit with a lot of stories. And the easy thing to do would have been to make him really inept, and like all of his inventions don't work. And that was sort of like the cliche way to go. So I didn't want to take away the comedy. So the challenge for us, for the writers, was figuring out how do we create a really interesting dynamic between these characters where the mom is solidly in charge, but the dad is not emasculated by that in any way, and we don't play that for humor, but we just kind of, like portray hopefully a realistic marriage, but also a realistic partnership, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and the kids as well do not fit into stereotypical gender roles. How did you come up with ideas for that, and how did issues of masculinity come up in that?
That's a great question. So we, from the beginning, wanted to sort of shake things up. I had done a lot of reading about the U.S. Lagging behind in the sciences, and I wanted to make sure that we had really strong role models for us young scientists. And so it was really important to me that Loretta, the sister, was a scientist, and we had been in touch with Google. They had this real initiative to get more girls into coding, and so that was very inspiring in terms of making her a coder. And we worked with female engineers from Google, and they gave us a lot of feedback, and that was great. So that was just sort of raise the profile of girls in science. But again, I wanted to make sure there was a balance. And with Miles, I wanted him to be adventurous, curious, and also really sensitive. I think partly because I was such a sensitive kid, I wanted him to have that side.
Fully human, right?
Exactly.
Fully human.
And I think that's something that's really important, something we talk about in this tip sheet, which is, show boys with multiple sides,
Right.
Everyone contains multitudes, and so even in an animated cartoon, we want to show that as much as possible.
So you've just laid out the template for essentially creating this utopic space, right, where gender norms and roles, which tend to be pretty limiting and damaging to boys and men and to girls and women, you've laid out where you create a space where you can imagine different possibilities. I'm wondering, one last question about the show and your work more broadly. How did research come into this process? You had mentioned the Gina Davis Institute, but maybe some other research. And
Sure.
How do you use that in this process?
Well, research is a really big part of every show I've worked on in different ways. Preschool TV is extremely dependent on research, both in the creation of the show. So, for example, Miles from Tomorrowland, which is set in space, we had a NASA advisor who was giving us feedback, giving us ideas. For Mira, Royal Detective, we have a cultural consultant who makes sure we're getting all the cultural details right. And that's a big part of it. But in a bigger sense, a lot of these shows also do qualitative research where we bring the stories into classrooms and test them out with kids and see what their responses are. So we actually make a storybook of the episode before it's been finished. It's created with art, about 10 panels of art, and we have Disney has a research team that brings them into preschools, and then we get detailed feedback on what worked, what didn't work, what kids found appealing, what they didn't find appealing. So it's really, I like to say that making kids TV, at least the way I do it, is a real mix of art and science, because there's the creative side, figuring out what these characters, who they are, who they want to be, who they wish they were, but also there's the science of what we know works for kids, how there's so much amazing research out there about child development, and I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of child development experts over the years who've taught me so much about that. So I'd love to ask you some questions now.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Of course, and can I just jump in
Yeah.
and say we're discussing men and
Yes.
masculinity and representations, and you can submit questions in the comment section on Facebook and the Q&A tab on Instagram. Also, links to resources will be shared in the comment section of Facebook, and if you're viewing on Instagram, you can view the resources in the link on our Instagram Instagram bio. So that is my, I'm delaying your questions just a few minutes longer.
No problem, and I'll do the next reminder. So Caroline, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your background and what led you to this area of research.
So I'm a political scientist by training. My PhD is in political science with a focus on women in politics and looking at how gender structures notions of women's leadership and power. And the big kind of upshot of my research in the past 20 years has been that Americans have a pretty deep-seated hatred of power-seeking women, and I mean men and women alike. And I know that's a big statement, but every time a woman seeks power, her opinion, polls will decline. And I just think about, all of the calls, for example, for Michelle Obama to run for political office. The moment at which she put her name in the hat would be the moment at which we would no longer love her. And that's actually how women in leadership works. And so it's so heartening, just to go back to your show, Miles from Tomorrowland, looking at you putting, the mother in charge and normalizing women's leadership. So I actually thought I was going to go back and work in policy and politics because that's where I started. But during my PhD work and after, I realized that while if you want to shift the culture, it takes lots of different institutions, right? It takes educational institutions, it takes policy and politics. But if I was going to put all of my eggs in one basket, the most powerful institution when it comes to bringing about shift in our culture, it would be media. Media, tells us about who we should love, how we should love, what our values are, what work we should be engaged in. Media has a profound effect on the world. And so I got into this work because I, after many years of looking at power and how it functions and operates, landed at media being the most powerful when it comes to shaping hearts and minds. And I believe that is actually the biggest shift, the biggest possibility for shift in our culture.
I totally agree. Yeah, in not exactly the same way, but I started out doing theater, which I loved, but I partly because I was doing it on such a small scale, it was just there was something about the limited number of people I was reaching with the stuff I made, and once I started getting into TV, I realized the megaphone that it was, and the way that, as we know, stories can fold in these incredible messages without being preachy or teachy. I also spent time as a teacher, but this felt like a way to reach people in sort of a deeper, more profound way, and I think that reflected certain movies and TV shows that affected me when I was a kid. I'm sure are there any that affected you that you feel like are still with you in terms of representation?
Well, oddly enough, I was raised Pentecostal evangelical. I was homeschooled, and I wasn't allowed to watch media content, and so as a young adult, it was actually, I entered it with pretty fresh eyes, and so I enter it from an outsider perspective, if you will.
Yeah.
I have plenty of shows now that I am, binge streaming that have affected my life for sure. But having media, entertainment media specifically, feel like it's simply entertaining you, I think that's the power of it, right? And how many times have people told you, oh, turn off your brain? Well, you can't turn off your brain when you're watching this. And more importantly, kids can't turn off their brain because they don't even really know what they're being exposed to. So well before they're conscious of being conscious, they're being told what the society values. They're being told who the society values. And just to go back to something I started earlier, right? It tells you what jobs are valuable. It tells you homemaking's less valuable, and working in the public, private sector where you're making money is more valuable. Men are valuable,
and a great example of that in kids TV, and this story's been told before, but my friend Chris Nee, who created Doc McStuffins, which has had such a huge impact on kids and adults, had a great story about how after watching that show, which is about a girl who's a doctor for her toys and her mother's a doctor in the show, a boy after watching the show asked his parents, can boys be doctors too? And I think that's like such a huge statement on how profound these messages are to kids, and normalizing it can have a huge impact.
Right, and I would say for adults, Grey's Anatomy, or how many women in my life, young women in my life, say, "Oh, I watched this show about doctors, and that's why I'm going into medicine." Or something as simple as, "Oh, I watched a show and I realized, oh, you could have a family life and you could be in STEM," right? And at the Gina Davis Institute, we've done a lot of work with Lyda Hill, and we've in terms of girls and representations of STEAM or STEM. We put the A in there as well.
I'm a big fan of the A as well.
The A. The arts, right? The digital arts in particular, getting more girls into that. And we find that, about 30% of scientists are women in popular culture. And so
great.
that underrepresentation, and while it's gone up, we still have a lot of work to do. Because if that little boy looks at Doc McStuffins and asks, can I be a doctor too, that means that this deluge of images where it's been primarily boys in these roles has been sending the same message to girls.
So that's a good segue for what messages we're sending to boys.
What messages are we sending to boys? So,
Can you tell us?
Yes, and I want to talk a bit about some research we've been doing with Promundo. They've put together 7 pillars of how we define masculinity in our culture. The man box, if you will, building on Paul Keivel's early work. So the 7 kind of pillars are how we represent men. We tend to show men and require them to be self-sufficient, so they're expected to be entirely self-reliant. They're expected to act tough. They're expected to be physically attractive but not work on it because it makes you weak or feminized to want to worry too much about your looks. We also expect boys and men to engage in pretty rigid gender roles, right? So men should be engaging in stereotypical activities.
Right.
They should be rejecting femininity, such as cooking, cleaning, and caregiving. And in fact, in our data, we find that men are less likely to be represented as parents, and they're also less likely to be represented as good parents. And that sends a very powerful message.
That's not good.
Yeah, heterosexuality and homophobia, so being gay or queer is not acceptable, right? That's feminizing. Hypersexuality, that men are supposed to be hypersexual and always looking to have, and they're assumed to be, heterosexual and always looking to be these sexual initiators or instigators, if you will. And then aggression and control, that men are supposed to be in control. And I would argue that, all the man box is mostly harmful to boys and men. We can talk about its broader cultural impacts on girls and women, but the man box is really about constraining and limiting boys and men. And so I see my work and what I do on masculinity as really being about work for men's liberation.
Wow. So would you say there's a men's liberation movement coming?
There is a men's liberation movement, but that actually means something a little different.
All right,
They've
maybe
already
we don't wanna get
co-opted
into
that
that.
language,
That's too
but
bad.
I'm still on
Okay.
it.
Maybe a masculinity liberation
There we
movement?
go. And
So-
can I just say, when
yeah.
we use the term toxic masculinity, right, and there's a debate about
Yeah.
whether or not we should be using this label because some men feel that, or some people feel that it's an attack on men. The very fact that we're using the term toxic masculinity means there are other types of masculinity that are not toxic.
Yeah.
And boys and men would benefit the most if we were to say, look, you actually don't have to fit the man box. You don't have to bifurcate your head and your heart. You can be friends with women. You can have close friendships with other men. And in terms
Yeah,
of
I was
media
just gonna
representation,
say.
you can do chores.
Yeah.
You
Well,
can play with dolls.
I think all the stuff you're talking about is why we came up with this, and maybe we could talk a little about the background of this sheet. So I've been involved with the Center for Scholars and Storytellers for a couple of years now, and I love what they do. I was at a session where we all broke out into different groups to talk about different subjects. One was foster care, and one was gender roles for boys and men on TV. And our group had a lot of great conversations about similar things we're talking about, what we see on TV, what we wish we could see on TV in terms of boys. And the idea came up to create sort of this sheet of statistics and suggestions that that can be put up, used in lots of ways, but primarily for content creators. The idea is we're creating a poster that can be put up in writers' rooms. And some of the things are exactly what you're saying, like here's a suggestion, show boys and girls playing together. And why? Because boys who have female friends are less likely to think of girls as sexual conquests.
And then the data that 25.5% men reported that they had committed some form of sexual aggression. And when you really get to the root of that, it's really easy to say, wow, 1 in 4 men has admitted to engaging in some form of sexual aggression. But really, the arrow needs to be at the culture, because if you require boys and men to be sexually in control and the instigators, and you encourage this behavior, of course you're going to get a stat like that.
Yeah. And then number 3, which is one of my favorites, show boys doing more chores, which I would love to tell my 3 boys about and have them watch a whole TV show about that. But Caroline, maybe you could talk about that article we were talking about earlier about chores and how important it is.
In the New York Times a few days ago had an article, and the headline, I'm gonna butcher it a little bit, but it was basically that young men, so we're talking about millennial men, engage or embrace gender inclusivity, right? They're all about gender equality, but they don't want to do chores. And at the end of the day, like, that's actually not embracing it. That's giving lip service to gender equality if you're not actually putting the work in. And so what we found, or what the research has found along those lines, is that girls and women are still engaging in more chores than boys and men. And in fact, if a woman is married to a man in a heterosexual relationship, with the same number of kids, she will actually do more chores in the home than a single woman will. And so there are definitely some gender stereotypes that come into play that still make the domestic sphere women's work, right? And men simply don't engage in it as much. And what we know is millennial men don't want to engage in it as much. So how far have we shifted away from those norms?
Well, and that kind of connects, I would imagine, to men as caregivers as well. I know you brought it up in the pillars, but it's something, I mean, I've read articles about fathers being more involved than in the past, and I see it. But it's interesting how I feel like that's something that is taking a while to shift in popular culture. I haven't seen a lot of portrayals of men as caregivers, and I'd love to see more. There's an anecdote about another show, not a show I worked on, but some others that I know, some writers I know worked on, where it's about some characters who take care of babies. And creatively, I know they wanted to have those characters be men, but the network was like, well, but isn't that a little creepy to see men taking care of babies?
No.
And I think
They're
it's like
caretakers
exactly.
too. They're humans. They're parents. Yes.
Yeah, and like, is there something weird about boys? And actually, they weren't even men. They were boys. They were kid characters. But is it weird to see them like wanting to hug and squeeze cute little babies? And that is really sad to hear that would even be an issue. But
and that a creative decision would have been made to reject that.
Right, and luckily, creatively, the right way, or the way we agree with, prevailed, and those characters ended up being male. But I think there was a lot of debate about that, and to me, it just shows how far we have to go in that one area of seeing males as caregivers.
Absolutely, and if I were a man, I would really be pushing back against these stereotypes, because that's a perfect example of how they're so limiting, right? That you want to be able to actually go into whatever sphere you want to go into. And I'll just take a step back and say, the second wave of the women's movement was really great in that we got a lot of women into the professions and the workforce, but we didn't actually have the same kind of value placed on caretaking in the home. So while we elevated one type of work, we did not elevate another. And we didn't bring men into the home. We didn't make it okay for men to be caregivers. And now we're paying the consequence of that now, half a century later. But we can shift it. We could actually shift it overnight if we had media that showed men as caregivers. And that's the power of entertainment media.
We're working on it. What's that?
Not only played for comedy.
Yes, exactly. Not like the bumbling Mr. Mom. Like, there was a whole movie of like how terrible
it was called
Mr. Mom. It was. For those too young to remember Michael Keaton as Mr. Mom. But and the comedy was that he was like inept as a caregiver.
Well, and that's one of the tropes or stereotypes we want to get rid of, right? Which is the bumbling father, whether it's Homer Simpson or Mr. Mom.
Right.
Yeah.
You guys.
So we do have some questions. The first one, submitted by Alda.
And maybe I'll ask this one because this is for you, Caroline. So Caroline, why does evolving the representation of boys and men matter for girls' representation?
Okay. So the ways in which we put men in the man box actually are harmful for the entire culture, right? And I will just say I want to focus specifically on boys and men for a moment to talk about, and then talk about the broader impacts. So toxic masculinity is actually a killer, and I really like to think of it in stark terms, because if you look at what it means for men to be in the man box, it literally kills men at higher rates than at every age than women. So if you think about where the man box leads, we encourage men to, for example, to engage in high-risk behaviors. Men are more likely to die from driving drunk, from driving too fast, from violence, from engaging in dangerous work, from engaging in dangerous activities, all of which is part of the man box and expectations from that. Also self-injurious behaviors, right? The food that we eat, and men being, eating a lot of protein or animal protein, for example, to be manly, and rejecting things like veganism or vegetarianism because it's feminized, even though so men dying at higher rates from heart disease, for example. Men being less connected to other individuals because of the man box, which makes them lonelier and more likely to be less healthy, lacking close relationships. Also, men don't seek medical treatment at the same rates. They avoid doctors more than women, and when they do go, they're less likely to follow the regimen. And I think the most profound one, perhaps, is the way in which the man box discourages men from seeking mental health, right? Help when they're in crisis. So we know, for example, because it's seen as making them vulnerable and weak, and which violates the norms of the man box. And so men die from suicide at a rate 3 times that of women. And of course, all of it is tragic. I'm not meaning to dismiss women who die from suicide, but men are simply not getting the help that they need. So what does this mean? It means that 50% of our population is feeling the pressure to be less healthy and less happy, and is constrained in ways that cause them to act out, right? More so than women. So if you look at rates of violence, we know that the man box is really the driver behind that. If you look at rates of mass shootings, we know that the man box plays a major role in that. And so girls and women benefit from better and healthier representations of boys and men at an individual level, because the men in their lives will feel more freedom and will not feel the need to assert the control that the man box tells them they need to. So on an interpersonal level, but even on a societal level, we would live in a much healthier culture if men did not feel the constraints of the man box that they feel. And media can play, as you've pointed out, an instant role in shifting our perceptions of the man box.
Yeah, wow. So it's good for everyone.
It is. It is. That's how we get to a healthier culture. And just to do the update again, if you're just joining us.
Oh, here, I'll do it this time. Thank you for the reminder. So if you're just tuning in, we're discussing male stereotypes, stereotypes of boys and men in media. And please submit questions in the comments section on Facebook and the Q&A tab on Instagram. We're going to link some resources at the end. And yeah, we're excited that you're watching, if you're watching. Thanks for watching.
And I have a question for you.
Okay, great.
Sascha,
Sure.
from Dylan Trupiano. How does gender representation differ in animation and live action? Does the degree of separation from reality and additional control in animation actually change the process?
That's a great question. I mean, definitely, as an animation creator, we get to really make what we want to see. That can go in terms of the characters' their proportions, their skin tone, how light, how dark. I mean, it's really every decision gets poured over on the shows that I work on. And so I haven't worked that much in live action. Obviously in live action you can, through casting, cast the people that you think are right and what you want to see. But one thing that I've been thinking about that's interesting about animation is, we can make anything happen. And this leads to actually one of the conversations that that we had that brought about this boys tip sheet, and that was with Daphna Lemish, who's an amazing researcher, has done a lot of research about gender roles in kids' TV, and she had this amazing statistic that female characters are 2 times more likely to use magic to resolve problems. And I thought that was just an interesting thing, and I don't know, I'm curious what you think that says, but the idea that magic can be a way to get out of things and to not deal with the real world. And it's tricky because we want our shows to be entertaining and we want them to be fun and exciting, and some of our shows do have magic, but we also want kids to take away the tools that might help them. A lot of the shows I work on have, if not a strong curriculum, like at least a light curriculum that is focused on social emotional behavior. We want kids to learn about how to deal with emotions. I'd say on most of the shows I work on, even if the hard curriculum is about outer space, there's always a soft curriculum, we call it, of social emotional behavior, and that stuff, that's how kids learn, is seeing how these characters interact. And if the characters can use magic to solve problems, it sort of takes away that learning because it makes it much easier than the real world.
Mm-hmm. So I would need to dig into it further,
Yeah.
but I have thought about this question a bit. I think that boys are more likely to be presented as using their bodies and their physical prowess in order to solve problems, whereas girls are more likely to be given magic in order to do that. So I think that it's maybe driven by a little sexism, but you bring up a great point. And I, especially looking at your content in Henry Hugglemonster, I was
You
the
go
social
deep.
the social emotional was really
Yeah.
obvious in that,
Yeah.
right? So he's running around and he is actually not just engaging in social emotional learning and application. He's saying it out loud while it's happening, and I'm assuming that was intentional for the audience because they're little.
Definitely. No, thank you for watching. That was a show that was also on Disney Junior. Henry Huggle Monster was based on a great Irish children's book by Niamh Sharkey, an amazing illustrator and author. And yeah, the idea that when I came onto the show, the way it was pitched to me was it's going to be basically Ferris Bueller for preschoolers, and so that was I loved that idea. And as the head writer, I really dug into that, and I felt like, well, if a preschooler was sort of narrating their day, what would it be like? And it's kind of hilarious if you think about it. Like if you were inside a kid's head, it's insane. And it was an opportunity to kind of work out the thought process for all these social emotional behaviors. So for example, if two of his friends are fighting, then he can say like, I don't know what's like, turn to us, the audience, and be like, I don't know what to do. My friends are fighting. Like, should I talk to them? Should I leave them alone? And it was just an opportunity to work out those kind of social emotional issues that preschoolers deal with all the time. But
and I'll say thank you because I have a family member who's on the spectrum, and that sort of the play-by-play, he was rapt as a child looking at it and following along because you were telling him, right? He has an issue reading emotions and exuding emotions, and so you were telling him what emotions were happening on the screen, and then he learned quite a bit from that. So
that's great.
I'm sure.
But that's great to hear. But yeah, I think that that the idea of what's so great about animation is that you can do that stuff and get inside characters' heads in a way that you maybe couldn't in live action. Okay, I see a new question. I'll give this one to you, Caroline. This is from Noah Morse. Can you think of any quintessential examples of male characters or TV shows that embody positive masculinity or push back on gender stereotypes? Why were they successful in doing so?
So 3 pop to mind, many more actually, but 3 kind of really prominent characters. The first would be Mr. Rogers, who did something similar to your Henry, right, where he is actually going through emotions and talking about that process and presenting a completely different form of masculinity. And I think it was especially powerful because of the time in which he was doing it, because we weren't actually having these conversations yet. I would say also Will Hunting from Good Will Hunting. I view that entire film, and I know it's old now, and I'm older now, a couple decades old, but I view it through the lens of him having this kind of journey about masculinity and being the tough guy and being raised. And there's some class issues there too, right? Being raised in a neighborhood where he wasn't allowed to have emotions or real friendships with men unless they were based around violence and control. And by the end of it, he has this mentor, right, in Robin Williams, who essentially gives him permission to be a full human being. And so I watch that film, on an annual basis because it really warms my heart to see a young man kind of being taken through that journey. And then I would say Terry Jeffords, Terry Crews's character from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, mostly because he physically embodies the man box in every stereotypical way, right? He is a massive man. He is ripped with muscle, and yet here he is just being a full human being, whether it's somebody who is a caretaker showing emotions or being sensitive. It's the juxtaposition between his physical presentation and who he is as a character that I think is so effective. And what about you? I mean, you must have a lot of
I do. I mean, it's interesting to me when actors riff on their own personas. So similar to Terry Crews, I love Dwayne Johnson and The Rock, but what I really love is when he plays on his like macho wrestler personality, and we see that sensitive side because there is sort of that. It just shows like in the tip sheet and what we were talking about that male characters can have different sides to them. Like I love movies where he's seen as a father because he's usually a good father in those movies, and you see this warmth that he has. In I think one of the Fast and Furious movies, you see him with his daughter, and it's just this great like I love an action movie that also has a sensitive moment between a father and a kid. I feel like there aren't that many of them, but I love it when it happens.
He does it on purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, every piece of content he is in or is producing, you see that kind of the challenge to the hypermasculinity.
Yeah.
So we appreciate that. So a question for you. From Nick Neal, what boys and men in your life have inspired you to push for better male representation in media?
That's a great question. Definitely starts with my dad. He was a teacher and a musician, and I think the arts are definitely a theme for me that keep coming back. But his love for music was such a big part of his life, and defined in a way who he was. And that sort of appreciation for and love for the arts was connected to, I think, his sensitivity, and really affected what I want to put in the world. Male characters who have that side, that sensitive side, that side that can appreciate the arts, that are creative. Again, it sort of connects to me going to performing arts school, to me connecting kids and the arts. I think it all goes back to that, my dad's love for music.
I would say that the boys and men who've inspired me to push for better male representation are the young men in my life, my students, my nephews, the young men I see struggling with something I thought maybe we had fixed a while ago, and then realizing, oh, boys and men still feel these incredible constraints and pressure. Something that Jackson Katz talked about in Tough Guys, 25 years ago when he came out with his documentary. I think it's watching them go through these same patterns of behavior. And, I love men. I really love men. The men in my life, especially the young men who are struggling with this, it's such a point of pain because I think a lot of them feel like they're alone, like, oh, I'm the only one who is feeling this pressure. And when you have someone who is, running a group like Ashanti Branch up in Oakland, who's running the Ever Forward Club, who creates a physical space for young men to really grapple with the man box and what masculinity means to them, or media that, like the content you're producing, where you provide a space where you're watching it and it becomes this kind of permission to be fully human. I think it's those moments in the lives of young men that really inspire me to do this work.
That's great. And then there's a second part to this question. How can we improve male representation in other forms of media, such as video games? That's a great question. I don't know a lot about video games. Do you?
So, other than playing them?
Yeah.
What? Yes, so at the Gina Davis Institute, we are embarking on the first kind of full scope analysis of video game content and looking specifically at masculinity. And it's tough to measure what's in video games. We know that it's problematic that you're asked to engage in first-person man box behavior, essentially. And so we want to know what choices young men make when they're playing video games. We want to know what options they have for masculinity when they're playing video games. And we do know that there are some effects of this, right? You're less likely, it lowers your levels of sensitivity to violence.
But it seems like it could be an amazing tool if used well, yes. That and like VR imagine being put in the first person and having to make these big decisions, and like, not that this would be a best-selling game, but like how to get out of the man box, like and really internalize those decisions and think them through. I don't know how to do it, but it seems like it could be an incredible tool for that.
Well, and I think the gaming industry is actually the next frontier, right? So we've gone into kids film, kids television. We've gone into advertising. We've even looked at mascots and looked at sexism and intersectional sexism there. But now I think the gaming industry going into the most popular games, and yes, creating new spaces and new games for people, but getting content creators who are working on this to understand the effects of their work, and that they can do it better, because I really do believe that content creators get in it like you because they want to have this positive impact. It's not just entertainment, it's not just a paycheck, they want to have some impact in the world. And so if you demonstrate through data-driven advocacy and lobbying, this is what you're doing and these are the effects, I suspect that that's the next frontier. So if you're just tuning in, we are discussing men and masculinity and representation. Please submit questions in the comment section on Facebook and the Q&A tab on Instagram. We will also link to resources. It can be shared, anything in the comment section of Facebook. And if you're viewing on Instagram, you can view the resources in the link on our Instagram bio.
And here's a new question. Speaking of questions, this is for Caroline from Anna Yang. What do you think is the most important aspect of the stereotypical male trope that needs to be challenged, and how can it be done well?
And I like that you said it was for me. I don't see my name on that.
No,
question,
it's
though,
color
Sascha.
coded, but I want you to take it anyway because I want to know.
I'll turn it back on you
Okay,
as well.
that's fine.
So I would say the biggest trope is the myth that men are violent. I think we actually tend to think that men are biologically creatures who are violent, and there is no bio data for that. There is no scientific data for that. If you unpack something like testosterone, it's actually linked to higher levels of confidence, which is fantastic. Men are not inherently violent, and we do boys and men an incredible disservice by sending them that message. So I would love to see the trope of men as inherently violent creatures challenged, discarded. I think it's interesting when we use violence in ways that are non-gratuitous, but it tells us a lot about how to solve problems, both interpersonally and maybe even on a cultural level if you're looking at content about war or conflict. But at the end of the day, get rid of the violent male trope. How about you, Sascha?
Well, I definitely have some thoughts. One of the points on the tip sheet that has always stuck out as an extremely important one is show boys being more caring with others, regardless of their sexual orientation. I think the trope of like, I don't need anyone, I'm good, like the solitary male, the loner, who doesn't need companionship, doesn't need support, doesn't need emotional, just being surrounded by someone who can accept their emotions and let them be emotional. So that there's this statistic on the tip sheet: more boys than girls report being isolated. Boys with close male friendships, however, are less prone to depression and more likely to live longer lives. So that just
there's the effects, the physical effects of masculinity, ending your life earlier than it should.
Yeah, right. It connects exactly with what you're saying.
And this is the tip sheet, right, that is available online. So
at the site Center for Scholars and Storytellers website. And again, this is something we've created to 10 research-based insights to change on-screen male stereotypes. And it's for anyone who tells stories, creates content, just to give you something to think about. And as you're creating, writing, drawing, male characters.
And I know we keep talking about this sheet, but why don't we just quickly run through each of these? So the tips are to show boys and girls playing together, show tough male characters being kind and vulnerable to other men, show boys doing more chores, show boys playing with typical female toys, dolls, and girls playing with typical male toys such as trucks, preferably in the same narrative, and then show boys being caring with others regardless of their sexual orientation.
And I want to mention along with that, there's a point that too often only gay boys are portrayed as vulnerable and caring, and being emotional and kind should not relate to sexuality, which I really agree with. It's definitely a stereotype that I would love to break.
Do you want to handle 6?
Sure. So 6 is show boys talking about love, girls making the first move both romantically and sexually, and girls buying flowers for boys. Again, happy Valentine's Day. Show male characters who are proud and accepting of having a primary caregiving role and the responsibilities that come with it. It's not creepy. It's cool. Show more, and also just, I'm going to take a detour there, just as a dad going to the playground. Like the other day I was at the playground, I have a 2.5-year-old boy, and I mean, it was all dads. It was all dads. Literally.
Hey.
It was all dads. Anyway, I know that's not every neighborhood, every city, but show more nuanced boy characters, not just stock types, 3-dimensional characters. Show a wide variety of body types being appealing, not just beach bodies, and show the full spectrum of gender identity. And this is really cool because one of the findings, I think, from the center is that Generation Z cares about embracing gender diversity and seeing different types of sexuality and gender, and that is a positive thing, so let's show it.
Yeah, and 56% of Gen Z actually identifies as being something other than male, female, or than being the binary and being heterosexual. So,
and then there's this statistic among all teens in California: 27% identified with some level of gender nonconformity.
Yep, it's a different generation. It's a different time when Facebook has 67 different gender categories instead of 2.
67?
67. At least that last check, it may have grown. And it's just in terms of the parenting, too. I think one of the stereotypes that abounds is a really, classist, racist stereotype that men of color somehow are not as good of fathers as white men, except the data indicate otherwise, that black men actually spend more time on caretaking than men of other races. And so I just really want to burst all of the stereotypes about parenting and fatherhood because
need a
they're
big
simply
needle.
not
Yeah.
true. Yep. So a question for you from Joshua Beza. Sascha, have you or anyone you know received any negative feedback from the general audience about your representation of boys and men in your work, whether that representation is positive and negative? And how have you responded to that feedback?
That's a great question. You know, I can't really think of anything negative that's come out of it. I mean, you know, so much of our audience is under 4 years old, so they can't tell us. But
They're not tweeting at you yet?
Not yet. We definitely do have some parents, which is great. I mean, I think that what I hope for with the shows I make is that they're co-viewed, that, you know, and we know that a lot of parents use TV as a babysitter. I do. But I think when parents can watch with kids, it's so much more impactful because they can talk about what's going on the TV. They can say, look how the mom's the captain. Isn't that, you know, like just point things out that kids might go by, especially the younger kids. So I don't know. I'll come back to you if we're still talking and I think of anything negative. I mean, there's definitely things people haven't liked that I've made and will continue to not like. But I think overall, I haven't gotten any negative feedback. You know, I've definitely gotten some positive feedback, similar to some of the things we were talking about. For example, about the Loretta character in Miles from Tomorrowland, who is a scientist. We had there was a great tweet by a dad who said, check it out, thanks to Miles from Tomorrowland, my daughter asked for a telescope for her birthday, and that was like mission accomplished.
There it
We've
is.
done it. Yeah.
Yep. Well, and that reminds me of the study we did with the Gina Davis Institute in archery, right? So there was this huge increase
I
in
read about
archery, girls who were signing up for archery in 2012. And so we were scratching our heads, and, you know, Gina was on her way to the Olympics for archery, this incredible athlete, and as well as an Academy Award-winning actor, and all of the things, activist, humanitarian. So obviously, I have a great deal of love and respect for her. So she looked at this and said, well, let's do a study. What happened in 2012? And what we found was that Princess Merida in Brave came out in 2012, and Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games came out, the first Hunger Games. And so we saw this dramatic increase in girls who wanted to take up archery, and that just a clear example of the impact of media on the lives of young people. Another question for you from Zuri Smith. How have you used experiences in your own life to diversify characters in prominent children's TV shows? And what are the most important takeaways that you want your audiences to grasp from the shows that you create?
Those are great questions. Definitely the experience of going to an arts high school and the arts having such a big role in my life have affected everything I do. So not only getting into the arts, but showing characters who do art, who make things, who create things. And I think that also comes from being someone who likes to make things and who always, even though I make TV, always worries about the negative effects of TV, of watching too much TV, of stunting creative growth and all that. And that sort of leads to the next question, which is one of the biggest takeaways is I want kids, after watching the shows, to go out and make their own things. I want kids to be inspired to tell their own stories.
How do you put that in the storyline? I'm curious.
That's a great question. It's not always easy, but we often have characters. I've had a lot of shows with where characters make puppet shows, or they create their own story. An episode of Henry Hugglemonster that I'm really proud of is about a bunch of characters who, a bunch of friends who love this comic book, and it's like a cliffhanger. Like every issue is the next episode, kind of the story, and they're waiting. They don't know what's going to happen next at the end of this one story, and the comic book's supposed to come out, so they all go to the newsstand. I guess people used to buy comics at newsstands, maybe. I don't know. They go to the newsstand to get the comic, and there's a problem. The comic shipment is delayed. It's not coming for a week. And they're like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How are we going to know how this ends? What are we going to do? And Henry, being the resourceful kid, says, why don't we make up our own ending? And so the rest of the episode is them acting out their own ending to the story. And the goal of that is to show kids, like, you don't need us to make these stories. Yeah, hopefully you're enjoying them and you're taking something from them, but what we really want to do is inspire you to tell your own stories.
That's incredible. I wish we had some research on the effects of that.
I'd love to hear what it was.
Okay.
So this is a question for you, Caroline. This is from Jim.
Oh, it says for both,
it is for
Sascha.
both of
It
us. I'm
says
not
for
passing
both.
the buck. How can we get to the point where we move beyond numbers and get to the deeper questions, like changing gender tropes, like girls using magic to solve problems? You've been listening. That's a great question. All right, let's start with that.
Well, and the follow-up, right, that how do we get policy people and funders and to take this seriously?
Yeah.
So I think the good news is that we now have enough data so that people are taking this seriously, because it's actually a public health crisis. So if you look at the health effects of the man box, and you look at the health effects also on the other side of girls and women who are taught that their bodies are their primary form of value, and so they engage in what we call self-objectification, which is seeing your body as a sex object. That's linked to eating disorders, higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicidal ideation, lower confidence levels, lower political efficacy, which is a belief that your voice matters in politics, and less civic engagement. And so we know that that rigid gender roles are a public health crisis because they have profound effects on our health and well-being. And we can quantify this in terms of numbers.
Mental health and physical health.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mental and physical health. And as a result of that, policymakers are paying attention. So, for example, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, who's the first partner of California, just started a new organization, her C4, led by Olivia Morgan, and they are looking specifically at the effects of media as a public health issue, media and gender as a public health issue. They're not the only ones. There are researchers all over the United States who are working on this and advocating at the state level to pass policies around media to make media content more positive.
That's great.
I think that I'm guessing in 10 to 15 years, sort of the way we view, unhealthy, unclean air as being an environmental and health crisis, we will view really negative media content as also a public health crisis, because the outcomes are quantifiable, they take lives, they cost money, and we all pay for it as taxpayers, and we all pay for it in terms of our society not being as healthy as it could be.
And then on my side of things, it's this. It's a start. I mean, it's a piece of paper, but our hope is that it gets out there and it gets content creators to really think about these things and make changes and start conversations that need to happen, like this one.
Mm-hmm. And if folks want to really get involved with shifting this, you can certainly support the nonprofits that are doing research in this area. Martha Lausen is doing research at SDSU, at the Center for the Study of Women in Film and Television, Darnell Hunt here at UCLA, Stacy Smith in the Annenberg Initiative, and of course the Gina Davis Institute and the Representation Project that is really pushing for this.
And then also the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, which has been an amazing resource for me, and something I tell all of the people I work with about, because I love research. Not everyone who writes creative things does, but like I said, what I do I really think of as a mix of art and science, and I think the art informs the science and the science informs the art, and thank you for all the research you're doing, because it reminds me why we're doing it. It reminds me why we're telling stories and trying to move the needle in terms of representation.
Well, and thank you for creating the content, because this is why we're doing it together, right? This partnership between academics and content creators, essentially.
Yeah, and I think it's an attitude thing too. I've definitely worked with writers who felt like, well, I just need to be free and be creative. Like, I don't want any researchers telling me what to do. But to me, that's not the right way to look at it. I think it doesn't have to be proscriptive. Like, that's not what this is. It's just giving you more tools in your toolbox and giving you a bigger context, because the stories we create, they're not in a vacuum. They're created in this world where things are always changing, and there are so many depictions of characters that came before the things we're making, and they all have enough impact on us.
Right.
We have one last question, which just came in, and it was so good, we were going to let you end it.
Great.
But, we thought we'd ask it, because I'm curious.
Okay, so this is from Angelina Volucci. Do you think the dominance of superhero comic book movies in popular culture over the past few years has increased body image anxiety in men?
Absolutely. So we're not only seeing it from these blockbuster films, we're also seeing it in terms of advertising. So all of the pressure that girls and women have had for so long in popular culture to be, unreasonably unhealthily thin and beautiful and attractive, and that's your primary value. We're certainly now seeing that push for boys and men, which is a shame, because if there's one thing we don't want to spread, it's body hatred and shame that most women feel. We don't want that spreading to men. But I do believe, that's a great question, Angelina, and it's certainly the case that boys and men are feeling more pressure. We know that simply by speaking with them about it.
But if we could make that a part of these comic book movies, it could be really interesting. I mean, again, it's like if we can somehow get these conversations, not specifically answers, but these conversations into those movies, I think it's so interesting because then it can lead to more discussion and debate and thought about it.
And Sascha, you bring up this great double-edged sword, right? Media, we've mostly spoken about it as being a negative force, but also it's an incredibly positive force where overnight you could just create different worlds, and those could be the worlds in which your imagination lives, and that's the first step in actually getting there.
Hi, guys.
Hey,
nice to see you
That
again.
hour like flew by. Seriously,
Oh,
you were
thanks.
both so great, so professional. Thank you. I'm Dr. Yelda T. Ools. I founded the Center for Scholars and Storytellers, created this incredible tip sheet with the help of both researchers, scholars, and storytellers. We are so glad you tuned in. We're very, very grateful to both of you. You did an amazing job. So thank you. And any last comments?
Happy St. Valentine's
Yes,
Day.
happy Valentine's
And we're
Day.
out.